So I'm very glad to invite the esteemed panel members. So first, Prem, would you mind joining us? So we all know Prem. He gave a very good talk yesterday about the Breer scores and the need for confidence in models. And we're looking forward to hearing what your thoughts are on confidence in AI in general and how to be responsible. And can I invite Audris next? I think your work on the supply chain work that you presented this morning is going to have a lot of implications for AI software too. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the responsible AI development. And Jack kickstarted the work on AI bomb and dataset license compliance. He's deeply knowledgeable about this area, and he's one of the superstars in the whole FMware space. Thanks. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Jack. And can I ask Bram to join us? Bram's done a lot of work on everything in software engineering. So whatever Bram has to say is going to be awesome. And Qinghua, as we saw from the presentation, I think she is the torchbearer for everything responsible AI all across the world. So we are very glad to have you join us in this panel. Thank you. So I'll kickstart the panel with the first question. So there's a lot of new regulations coming up, and many of it is conflicting. Say, for example, EU AI Act says you need to opt out of, you need to have provisions for opting out from your AI, opting out so that your data cannot be used, or they don't really say copyright is null and void, whereas in Japan, it's fair game to use data for machine learning training. So what are your thoughts on this, and what do you think, how do you think software engineering has to evolve to adapt for this when shipping products across different demographies? Hear from Jack first.
Okay, I get the mic first. I think, well, first of all, we have to think about rethinking at least about the software engineering process. So originally we're thinking about this whole waterfall models, and then now we all switched to this kind of agile thing, and then later on it's DevOps and so on. But with these compliance related things coming in, then we really have to start thinking about how can we better incorporate this kind of compliance stuff into our software development process. And one of these kind of simple example is, for those of you who kind of did intern or work at company before, you probably know at the very beginning, you need to go through things like privacy analysis, threat modeling analysis, and so on. And same with performance, they're thinking about we have to do performance by design. So in other words, many of these kind of trustworthy concerns has to be kind of considered and planned earlier and being evaluated continuously throughout the software development cycle. So same thing with this kind of compliance related regulations and requirements and so on. We have to really kind of first extract them out from these various kind of regions, domains, industry, and so on, and start kind of baked it into the various kind of a process in the software development in terms of checking whether they're being compliant, and also, as you said, in some cases, checking whether certain things, whether that conflict or not, and how well are we going to deal with that in the software design and the testing phase. Because if not being careful, many of these effort we done at the downstream would actually be wasted. So for example, as you mentioned, let's say GDPR kind of related requirements, and some companies or some country even require you saying the data cannot leave the site. So that restricted, a particular way of, let's say, implementing the system, or how you can train and influence the model and so on. But if you don't think about that early enough, and start only evaluating at the testing and those phases, then that means you wasted essentially a lot of time and development effort.
Okay.
Yeah, honestly, I haven't really thought much about legal compliance, but I mean, one thing that's interesting is that we've been thinking about joint human AI decision making when using code output by generative models, and so we've been thinking mostly about it in terms of correctness. But I guess suppose one could think about it in terms of reliability or other kinds of regulatory issues that come up in using code produced by language models, including, for example, the risk that the code that is being generated is at risk of being copyrighted or somehow verbatim reproduced from some training data. So I suppose that some of the stuff we've done could also be generalizing to other contexts.
Okay, I'm curious, like, how would the work that you're talking about transfer to this context? Because so right now it's about calibrating for correctness, right? Like, and that's understandable. How would one calibrate it for legal stuff?
I don't know. I mean, if there is a way to give a risk associated, a confidence or some measure associated with, how likely it is that the code that is being generated is likely to be from training data that is protected, or, or something about like different kinds of risk in the code, security-related risk, or, or safety-related risk. If there's a way of characterizing that, because correctness is very general, it just means test passing. But if you can get more fine-grained risk, then people could make better decisions about whether to use the code or not.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, to me, the situation is a bit of a mess. I would call it that way, because on the one hand, you have like all these acts and legislation coming up. You have like, say, European Union has also this kind of assessment list for trustworthy AI, which supposedly can help companies when they want to release a product to figure out, did I do this, did I do that, and so on. There's a lot of kind of, for instance, attention in there for, as also your talk about FM bombs was about transparency. Being able to know why is this prediction being made, based on what data set, based on what model, and so on. So very detailed legislation. But then just a simple question like, what's a model version actually? What's the data version? Llama 3.2, actually also in your demo, you had to specify that. Was your demo or Cahilia or Gustavo maybe?
Probably Gustavo is the only one who did demo so far.
Yeah, so the 3.2 is a 3 billion version, and it's different from that version, which could be the latest or not. Exactly, yeah, you have the quantization, distilling, you have all these things. So are these, like, is the 3 billion version, like, is that the similar version as the 70 billion, and the quantized, and it's a mess. Data thing is the same, so I don't know. So there's a lot of legislation, but there's a lot of work needed to make it work. That would be my summary.
Thank you.
So do we go online first, or
you can go first, and I'll go to Qinghua next. And next question, Qinghua can go first.
So I have a story to tell. So I'm collecting World of Code data, and at some point I'm getting that at home. Actually, I'm getting this very legal-looking letter that requires signature, and it turns out from some law firm, and that law firm is representing some tiny little company that's trying to sell itself to some investors, and they're concerned that their developer put their code, supposedly their crown jewel intellectual property, on GitHub without permission. And that crappy code, as it turns out, was kind of what the buyer was paying money, and they did not like the idea that it's published. So it turns out that Microsoft has ability to track all the Git clones of the data, as long as you use not HTTPS but the kind of SSH. And so from them, they got information that at some point my script scraped that information, cloned that repository while it's there. And so they contacting everybody who's done that to make sure that they lose all that data that they scraped, because that was unauthorized release of the data. Well, so that's kind of first thing, right? So once I got that, had the contact with this original company, and I said, hey, I can't, I don't have your repository, I delete it, but I extracted all the Git objects from it and I incorporated it in the world of code. And I cannot delete these objects because many of those are not yours. They're actually created outside in open source. But the ones that I seem to see no other places that they're copied, that they exist in, I'm willing to sort of replace with messages saying, please contact this company, this person, if you think that code is yours and not theirs because they claim that that's theirs and so. So you don't really need to wait for faraway future to see that happening. So my feeling is that in a few years, once this legal thing is settled, OpenAI will have to devote a lot of money to paying for the copyright infringements that they did in terms of using actually other people's texts that are not even permissively licensed, let's alone with no license. So I think that will play out in some way or other, but obviously innovation is not really a friend of regulation. So I think while we can, let's do as much as we can, right? And then to take a kind of a negative hat or kind of put on some horns on me, I would say so there's certain things that observed companies do, like for example Microsoft is really careful not to track information about who is generating code and what code is generated, perhaps for exactly the same reason that if they don't track it, nobody can force them with subpoena to really reveal where that OpenAI code ended up in and dealing with all the mess down the road. So, just be careful when you do any sort of analysis to kind of try to avoid actually doing anything that unethical. But also, think about various sort of actual, realistic problems that might happen in the future. So that's a brief thing that I wanted to say.
Okay, and Qinghua?
Yeah, just want to add one recent paper I read from ETH. So they have done a mapping from the EU AI Act to the technical requirements then to benchmarks. So I think it's maybe an example of how to address the regulatory requirements for, I think from software engineering perspective or technical perspective, like maybe mapping could be one of the methods to do that.
That's great. Hopefully you can share it with us later.
I will share in the chat.
And do you have anything else to add?
No, but I think because these days we also working on a text copilot. So maybe it's a bit related to this question. So we have the, for example, in Australia we have Australian text database, legal database. So all the information is stored, like the regulatory requirements or the private ruling, public ruling. They are stored in that database. So we help the customers extract the rulings from that database and generate response. So I feel AI can also help address AI's law requirements.
Fair enough.
So using AI for AI.
Fair enough. Okay, I want to ask one more question and then just open it up to the audience. And I've always wanted to try this with a panel, so I'm going to just go for it. How many of you guys among the panel think synthetic data should have copyright or license? Or how many of you think license doesn't apply for synthetic data? Because I have an interesting story to share too. I was recently in a compliance summit and I was talking to a few lawyers, and some of them were like, well, AI doesn't have creative expression. So if it doesn't have creative expression, it doesn't have copyright. So synthetic data is not copyrightable. But that kind of, in my opinion, it kind of devalues all the data that the model was trained on and all the painful lengths they went to create and curate the data. So what's your guys' take on it? And if there are diverging opinions, I want you guys to debate a bit.
I think though, copyright and license not the same thing. So which specifically?
Talk about both.
Right, and license is
is
permission, so
yeah.
it's opposite things, right? So
no. So you can give rights if you hold the copyright, right?
So,
So copyright allows you to tell people what you can do, and copyright is the right of being able to tell that. So
AI model, can you ask AI model, are you willing to give copyright to your products?
but is the content generated by AI model copyrightable? Does it have that right? Maybe let's just talk about copyright.
Yeah, so my feeling, it's even though, so again, it's a legalese, right? But even though technically the model is not a person, right? But the model creators are probably people. And so the output is probably copyrightable, similar in a way that output of ImageNet is copyrightable. But it's complicated because you have, you might have copyright, but you may not have copyright to the source data. So then you run into these problems that you have derived work for which you don't have permissions. So even though the created work you may well copyright it, you might run into trouble. Somebody whose work you use to create that work might still sue you because you perhaps didn't follow their license. So I think it's pretty to me it's pretty obvious, because even if the model itself is not really an agent, a person who actually created and ran the model, or the group, or the company usually, is probably going to claim it's an agent, and it needs to collect its royalties. But anyway,
Okay.
that's just my thought.
No, perfect. I have something to say about that, but I want to hear from the panel.
So the other thing I'm wondering, like for source code, you have this, for instance, these viral license like GPL, so that if you use that, the code using it also has to have that light and so on. But I'm thinking, okay, data itself, if you like manually generated data, if you put the GPL license on that, it's being used to train a model. Could legal experts claim that then the output of the model inherits the GPL license, hence synthetically generated data would also, so there might be precedents that could be abused maybe for that. So yeah.
I just wanted to add one more thing. So whatever the output is, I'm not a legal scholar. I think it's great, great opportunity to take the legal profession in that particular area, because I think there's going to be a lot of work in there. But I just wanted to put a quick plug. My student collected all the 3 million different versions of the licenses that are in open source, and mapped them into much smaller number of SPDX licenses that are available.
Very cool.
And also extracted some basic properties of these licenses. So Google, and then identified copies of the code from one repository to another where the license was not copied. So you have this very complicated network to explore if you'd like to.
Yep, for sure. Let's quickly go to Qinghua and then hear from Prem. Qinghua, you have, what are your thoughts?
I think I just want to mention, like, it's one of the topics in the AI Safety Institute convening the end of this month. So the discussion will be also driven by Canada and Australia together. And we prepare some input for that meeting. I think synthetic content, we talk about the transparency methods like watermarking, fingerprint metadata. I think the main purpose is to track the provenance. But then from software engineering perspective, there could be more like trade-offs about privacy security, like you may have some private data in the generated watermarking, and also depends on when you generate the watermark, whether the data is generated, or the data or the content after the data or content is generated. So I do think provenance tracking could help to address this issue.
So you're clearly saying synthetic data is copyrightable too, and that's what the stance has been so far. So what do you think, Prem?
So I'm a bit confused by the question. So is the output of a compiler copyrightable? If an output of a compiler is copyrightable, then why not the output of a language model in response to a prompt?
So compiler is built by, let's say, a company, right?
Yes.
And that company, its company's creative expression, and compiler's license might allow you to do whatever, which means that if the license is permissive, then whatever you compile with it, you can copyright it, because the license of the compiler allows you to do so. Same law applies, but let's say this compiler was trained on a bunch of different data which has licenses of its own, and the creator of this compiler has no right to those data to give any right downstream, right?
I see.
So that's why this question exists, in my opinion at least.
I see. So if model is trained on a lot of data that is owned by other people, and I give a prompt to it, and the language model produces a code based on my prompt, then if I think I should own the prompt because I crafted this prompt to produce some output.
Yeah.
So then, I don't know. It's very confusing. I don't understand.
Nobody does.
So I guess I would first kind of make a comment saying, in the sense, even if it's copyrightable, it doesn't mean copyrightable forever, right? Because none of these countries would say, if you own a piece, it's effective for your lifetime. So let's say some of these great literature work or those things, it's only copyrightable for, I don't know, what's the thing for US? 10 years? 20 years?
80, right?
It's now like closer to 120.
Yeah.
Yeah, so but it's finite, right? So I
It could be extended though.
but then the question is actually really not whether it's copyrightable or not. It's first, do we really have the ability to link where the synthetic data actually comes from? So sometimes, as Prem said, it can be as a result of a prompt, but it may trigger some of their internal kind of data they trained before. Can we actually associate with that? Or some of the other cases, as we see for synthetic data, is we actually have some seeded data. And it's really not synthetic data as synthetic data. It's just kind of mutated a little bit here and there. But I guess unless we can get to the point of even able to pinpoint where the synthetic data actually comes from, then we can actually start thinking about whether it's copyrightable or not, or whether it's even possible if it's too old, right? Like a
Software supply chain of fourth kind, we're gonna have information where exactly it came from. No, just kidding.
okay.
So is there a length of the number of
Mike, do you want to give him the mic?
Sorry, supposing I have some text, is there like, what's the length of the n-gram that I'm in violation?
Yeah, I think there is like an excerpt that you can use for but you still can't use it for for job like you can use it for certain purposes, short excerpts, but not long ones. But you still cannot use them for other purposes, right? So you can write a paper and quote something, right? But that quote, if it's short enough, you can do that. But if it's too long, then you cannot do that. But then, if you say use that in some other way, it might still not be allowed, right? So it's still, the purpose is also very important. But what I mean is, you could probably still detect the origination of that. So there are techniques like, for example, if you put the original text, how does the model react? And if it reacts in one way, then perhaps it was used in training. If it reacts another way, perhaps not. So I don't think it's impossible to do the tracking to some extent, at least probabilistically. So you can imagine that at some point there will be a way to track things back.
So before May asks this question, I just want to add something to that. So you told how synthetic data, whoever creates it might have some say to it, right? So there was a ruling recently. An artist created a art with DALL-E, and his claim was, I can copyright this art because I created it. I painfully worked with, he prompted it 600 or 700 times. And the judge said, whatever the model created, I cannot allow copyright. So if you can clearly say what you contributed to the art and what the model contributed to the art, I can let you copyright the parts that you contributed. So that's one stance too. But May has a question. I really want to keep talking about this, but I need to open it up to the...
Yeah. So there's the question of copyright and all of this. But if you look at, so Microsoft released some data with the GitHub Copilot. So GitHub released the data that they did some studies, and only about 1% of the code was verbatim from somewhere, right, in their studies. This came out, I think, like 2 years ago or something. Now, whether you believe that number or not is a different thing. I would think that, like, my experiment and Prem's experiment from the MSR paper begs to differ. About 40% of the times or 50% of the times we see verbatim code, either the fix or the bug, right? I was verbatim. So I don't know if you believe the 1% or not. But since then, Copilot now has a feature that you can set a flag that says, do not include any code that is a clone that is there in your repositories right now. So I can choose, if that is set, that's a very strict thing. And they will do, I think, something like a SHA comparison or something like that. I don't know how they do it. But they will avoid if there is anything that is verbatim the same somewhere else. And you can even play around with it and say, remove it only if it is GPL, but if it is Apache, include it, right? And so you can play around with these things, and that feature has been around in Copilot now for about a year and a half, I would think. So there are, and this is, I mean, whatever Copilot does, Cursor will follow with, and all of these guys will also do, because that's what the competition requires, right? So there is the question of, what will happen if there is copyright problems, but there is also, there's already some prevention mechanisms happening. And in all the cases that have been tested against Copilot, they've all lost. They've all lost the cases so far, because they have not been able to prove that Copilot spits exactly the same thing, because the way that they can get Copilot to say the exact same piece of code is through a very tedious set of prompts, basically saying, copy from this repository and give it to me. Unless you say something that explicit or very convoluted, tedious kind of thing, it will not copy, right? I don't know what they're doing behind the scenes. Like GPT might do it, but tools that are built on top of GPT that are helping developers are not doing this, right? So that's something to keep in mind in these discussions, is how much of it is practically possible.
But software as a whole encompasses more than just the code generation part, right? Like, we are thinking about images, we're thinking about video, and this discussion kind of, like, and they've done some fantastic stuff around code. And code is also an easy asset to deal with in this sense, right?
Yeah, I agree. But I just want to say with code.
Oh yeah, that was a valuable input. David has just one second. Just wait for the mic so that.
I guess I'll also note, like, originally this started as a question about synthetic data. And synthetic data as a concept is a little different than kind of AI outputs, like if you're talking about individual functions or individual images or these kinds of things. So, I mean, as I understand it, copyright is about copyright's creative decisions. And if you have this process where you have synthetic data where you go out and your thing makes, you know, an entire encyclopedia, or, like, you know, there's a few examples of this, like Cosmopedia or whatever. That's different than generating individual outputs, but even the individual outputs is also borderline as well.
And, do you guys have any thoughts on this?
Well, for sure, with the Copilot switch, we will see some very creative for loops, I guess. But the thing, I'm just wondering, because like Copilot, especially code, it generates code, suggestions code, but I mean, AIware is more than just the code, as also mentioned. So you probably would also envision like these tools to come up with data that you can use for in your AIware, so maybe synthetic or not. Models, curricula that was mentioned as a new kind of asset, prompts, you name it. So and then given as also the comment provided, those more tricky kind of legislations will definitely play a bigger role. So I don't know, it will definitely, like legal people should definitely, maybe they also have this kind of infrastructure like this place here. We could go there next time. But I think it will be important to like bring them in, because it will get very, very tricky. That's for sure.
I just want to bring one point. I think asking this at the end user researcher point of view, I think it's actually not the right group of people to. Instead, it's actually the service provider that have to think about how to make that happen. Or right now, what they actually did the other way around is, since we're talking about Microsoft, they actually are the first group to introduce that copyright shield, right? So in other words, let's forget about anything. As an end user, do whatever you want with the tool, or think about ways to kind of deal with all the legal stuff, right? Then that's at least seems to us, maybe we have a little bit room in terms of maneuvering and to figure things out, while the big company actually creates some kind of protection shield for us to kind of deal with them, or maybe after a couple lawsuits from these big companies and so on, things would actually be clearing out, right? So I just don't think, maybe it's not something, at least, researchers or students is something really they have to be too much concerned about, assuming, we're using some of these copyright shielded kind of AI tools, right? But which is a lot.
Qinghua, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's not our expertise, but we can maybe make the technical infrastructure ready to whatever to support the legal part, right? So like the agent ops infrastructure I mentioned in my talk, or if we have like a very fine-grained login repository, so we can record like key input, output, not only model, but like if they use external data or external content to generate this synthetic data content, we can also record it. So could be helpful if there's some argument about the copyright later, we can trace back what is the source data and who has handled this, processed this.
Okay.
So
Sorry,
could I ask a question as well to the panel?
Sir?
Could I ask a
Yeah.
question to the panel as well? Because this morning we had the interesting talk about supply chain, basically for VMware. The problem, though, even if you can find that some code is similar to somewhere else or some data is similar to somewhere else, there's the age-old problem of like correlation versus causality, like who took it from who. So I was just wondering, are there any kind of promising directions we could actually figure that out, because that would have a big impact on, the usefulness of this thing.
Well, so it's always answer is world of code, right? So there's a timestamp, right? So if you believe it, it's not always right, but there is a timestamp with associated with a transaction, right? And so people like Hugging Face also starts to use Git version control system as well. So many of these things are timestamped, right? Of course, as long as they're public, you have timestamps. You don't know what happens, behind black doors, closed doors. But there, there's some indications about what came first and what appeared after. I mean, you don't know exactly where it was copied. If there's copied once, maybe it was copied from the other place than the origin. But at least that part, I think, is fairly easily traceable in public.
Yeah, because the one problem is that you have Hugging Face, which is kind of like where you download Debian packages, like it's distributed, in this case, models and data. But then you also have the GitHub, the upstream, the GitHub repository, maybe the scripts, the bugs and so on for that thing. So it's and you have things like rebasing, cherry picking. You have a lot of messy thing. You have, like, for instance, a Hugging Face. If you can indeed update the model weights of a given model. So if today you want to use that model through Hugging Face's API versus next week, you're probably using a different version of the weights without knowing.
For version control, so the Hugging Face are nice. So they allow you LFS because GitHub would charge you like arm and leg for storing data and models. So Hugging Face so far doesn't, and so you can actually do version control and they encourage you to do version control both for models, data, and everything. So even for very large data. So that's kind of nice of them, but I don't know how long that will happen. But so people usually keep the models and data on Hugging Face and their kind of software stuff on GitHub or some other place like that. But then finding links might be a little bit tough.
Actually, I want to address what Jack said. Oh, sorry, you go on. Oh, so you told it's not our problem. Let the companies figure it out, right? So I have a question for you. So developers are our problems, right? And developers are asking if I can do this when I'm not using these big tools. And second, a company saying, let us deal with it is probably, it's going to lead us to bad places. So shouldn't we be the ones figuring this out? And more importantly, do we even have the right tools to figure it out? Like even the current licenses, as we, in one of our work, we found out most of the open source licenses do not help with dataset licensing or model licensing, and we need new sets of licenses. And our companies they have no incentive to do this.
So, but if the license doesn't say anything, that means it doesn't allow anything. That's really the result, right? So if it doesn't say, can it be used for models, that means it cannot be used for models, because licenses are explicit about, that's how the legalese is. If it's not there, it's you're not allowed. The
Exactly.
rights, all rights reserved, so.
Exactly, and now the developers are like not the people using fancy tools, the people who are going to be using open source models or open source code generation tools. Now they are stuck because we didn't create nice licenses, right?
Well, again, I'm not a legal expert, but there's always a term, I think, for many of these many of these countries' legal system called due diligence, right? So in a sense, as developers, we follow the rules, do the best we can. So under this kind of copyright shield kind of things, we know the rules, and the company already said, do as what the term says, and then we'll deal with all the copyright issues. So that kind of quite covers in terms of due diligence, at least from my standpoint of view. And that's why I was saying, so unless you start explicitly poking things around, then that really means, what is your capability set in terms of due diligence, right? And that's a very kind of gray area. But as a normal developer, I think as long as we follow the terms offered by whatever the service provider, we did our due diligence, which is not something we have to worry too much.
So,
Abraham has a question.
I have the mic, so I'm going to.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
So I think Jack is right in that, Gopi, is that it doesn't have to be a big company. It can be even a small company, but whoever the company that is wrapping things around the model, they are providing their users with the ability to either use it or not. The users of that service are going to just rely on this, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be Microsoft. It can be Macrosoft, which is a 3-person company in Markham, right? Which says, you know what, we are going to create this image generation thing, but we take responsibility for it. Our lawyers will defend it.
Yeah.
Right? And if they provide that, then they can people will use that tool.
Yeah.
There's going to be very few production-ready people who will directly go and download Llama 3 billion and take prompts or things out of it and then do it. You're going to use a service for it, right?
I want to discuss that more, but I want to hear from Abram first.
I have a question, but I'll ask after.
Okay. Sorry. We need to give other people a chance.
Hi, thank you for the discussion. I want to first comment on open source licenses. 99% of them have one requirement, which is you must attribute the source. So you have to attribute who wrote it. Exceptions include WTFPL and X11 license. So in general, most of the LLMs will never do this at the moment, unless they do after the fact code cloning, which I guess that's kind of in our wheelhouse. We can do that. But I think a bit more interesting stuff would be the ethical guardrails that these companies try to put on the models to try to stop people from doing things. A lot of these things get in the way of actual work and they kind of weaken the model in terms of dealing with actual reality. I was wondering, I wanted perspectives on this. Like, should they be putting guardrails in? What kind of guardrails should they be putting in? Does this damage what we're trying to do? Should we have guardrails for software? That's the general gist of the question.
Who wants to go first?
Well, so for sure, I mean, I'm tracking some Reddit channels for local LLMs and so on. They also talk about new closed source ones. And number one, first comment is about, oh, this one, there's too much guardrails, I can't do this, it's too restricted. It's So definitely it's something that the thinkers at least are really concerned about, and for them it's a reason to ditch that one and go to the next one. So in that sense, the model kind of lost a bit its goal. Now that these are kind of special, they are the makers, I guess, where the first they were talking about software makers. But then who are everybody else who, in terms of responsible AI, has to be protected and so on? So from which are 99.99% of the people, I guess for them it is important those things are in place. But the question though is that should this guardrail be something configurable per application, per product, instead of baked in? That's a good question, and there's very widely ranging opinions on that.
Very good question. I only have heard one instance where I think it's a problem, and it's well recognized, is that these models are very, very positive. So it's very hard to tell if anything is good or bad. So the only way you can get any sort of evaluation that's not very, very excellent idea or the excellent piece of code is to really do comparison. So now, whether that's sort of removing that niceness, introducing some nastiness into the model, whether that would make these tasks of evaluating the quality of the responses better, I don't know. But I mean, that certainly is, it's not like it's preventing you getting objective evaluation, but it's making it a little bit harder because you really need to do ranking as opposed to absolute values.
So I guess guardrail goes two ways. First is that the user, when they send the input, the guardrail may just reject it and saying this is outside my service kind of area or service agreement domain. I'm sorry, I cannot answer that. So that's one use case. And the other use case is when the AI model or AI system compute the answer, give the output, and then the guardrail basically checks if it conforms with whatever the principle, the constitution, or whatever the rules. And in some cases, it even refine the answer in the sense, it uses the required language or reduce some of the content, right? So in short, I think guardrail is needed, but the problem is right now it's by no means perfect in the sense sometimes it's too restrictive, and that's what people are saying, sometimes, let's say, the cloudy is kind of reject more attempts in terms of asking questions, even though some of them are perfectly innocent, right? But in many of these cases, it's probably needed in the sense it filter out the sensitive information or whatever is outside the service domains. I guess it really depends on the domain. Some of them can be more kind of, conservative in the sense it's better kind of sorry than never, right? So you reject something as long as you're being safe. But for the other ones, maybe they can be more kind of loosen up and liberal. So unfortunately, I think this is a case-by-case kind of scenario, but definitely we need guardrails.
I guess one thing I find this whole discussion very confusing. So one thing I don't really understand is what the difference is between copyrights for natural language and copyrights for code. Is it just all these differences arise from these various licensing schemes that people have put in for code, like open source license, or does it arise from the metamorphic transformations in code? That is, I can take some code and rewrite it 50 different ways to Sunday, and it essentially is executing the same algorithm, but in order to detect that it's the same algorithm, no lawyer is going to be able to figure this out, right? So, I mean, does that matter in terms of what is,
so far, as far as I know, so far code has been treated as text, and you can put a lot of these licenses on natural text if you want, but it won't matter as much, right? Like they're being used in different contexts. But with the new regulations, which is I think European, one of the 3 new regulations that they introduced, I think code is no longer going to be treated as a piece of literature, or like software is not going to be treated with same rights as literature. Now software has liabilities, like they can claim damages. So all the licensed text that used to say no warranty applies, no luck. Even if you say that, if your software causes damage and people prove it, they can claim liabilities. Mm-hmm. So software is now is being treated as a different entity, which is regulated. And so for that instance, we need to start, so because of things like that, and AI being in the center of this, we kind of, at least my take is we have to figure it out. Jack and May don't think so. But to that, I also have something, but let's finish.
Yeah,
this.
I'm just wondering, if I give a powerful enough language model some copyrighted code and say rewrite this as much as possible so it's completely unrelated to the original, but does the same computation. Is that?
I don't think that's a problem though, because if you take a copyrighted image, you see it, and then you draw it, or you get something from it, and you're inspired and you draw something from it, then it's okay by law at least.
So as long as the algorithm isn't patented, I'm okay. I can rewrite the code and then I'm out of the copyright regime.
I think so. I don't know.
So that's weird.
It is. Qinghua, did you have anything to add for the guardrail discussion or any other discussion right now?
Yeah, I think for guardrail discussion, I was thinking like we also need to think about the artifacts generated in this process. It's not just the final output from agent or AIware AI system, like the reasoning, whether the reasoning makes sense or is ethical or the client is compliant with some regulations. So if we think all types of artifacts, so it's not just about the prompt. Can be the plan generated, can be the tool the agent can call, or the result from the tool. I think guardrails should be like broader than model output input. That's my viewpoint.
Okay. This David.
So I guess sort of off of the previous comment about guardrails, I think it's important to consider that when talking about like these things from like OpenAI or others of how they will refuse certain things or these similar things, I think these should not be considered guardrails. Like these are a separate concept. So there's a concept of aligning the model and making sure that the model's kind of core beliefs and intents and goals are aligned with those of humanities and users. And that's different than certain guardrails or controls that we put on the model. And that they're different things and they should be thought of as differently. And that those kinds of things at the model level are more important for the alignment aspect. So I think this sort of leads into this question around, or is a component of a question around what are things that we are not ready or we should not build FMware for. So maybe there's some things we should just maybe flat out never build FMware for. And there's some things maybe we should build FMware for, but we're not ready yet. So my question, I guess, is there any thoughts on those things? And what are the steps we need to kind of remove and step along those things that we're not ready for yet?
Okay. Qinghua, do you want to take this first?
Yeah, I'm not sure I got the question clearly. So you mean for the guardrails?
I think the question was, what are some applications or what are some areas for which we should never build an FMware for, or maybe we are just not ready to build an FMware yet, and what areas are okay? Is that right?
Yeah, that's the general point, and then also kind of bonus question of the things that we're not ready for yet. How do we get to that, be ready? What are the key components to get ready for that?
Yes, I think if you think about the traditional AI ethics process, the ethics process, the first step of one project is whether the application type is appropriate or is ethical. So that could be like one example for your question. But I feel like if you look at the AI safety, current efforts on AI safety, I think the focus is on like high AI applications with dangerous capabilities and potential harms. So high risk applications is a focus. So I'm not sure like whether we can like avoid the application of AI, but from regulatory perspective, maybe we also need to think about if this happens, if the capabilities are not predicted, some like emerging capabilities from AI, what can be the solutions?
Maybe let me try to kind of discuss this in a different angle instead of the legal copyright kind of
You
cases.
have 1 minute, Jack.
Yeah, so like the way we look at the FMware is like underlying there's a model, right? And we know model inference is generally much slower than you do the basic computation, like the instruction kind of set. So in other words, if there's something which involves with higher performance and has deterministic behavior, then it's I would say it's highly unlikely you want to infer that with a model, but you build with traditional approach. Like for example, like a basic compiler or calculator, you better off kind of build it with the basic kind of, the usual kind of codeware kind of style, because again, using these model to do inference, the best you can do is matching that performance, not exceeding it, right? So that at least that would be the way I'm thinking about what would be the ones, FMware probably are not really good at.
So for sure, criminal activities definitely should not be using that. I would even say the stock market. I would never would like to see that. But I don't know. Yeah. So performance is an interesting point of view there. But I don't know. I'm kind of a bit like a skeptic in general for AI. So I don't want to see that many applications, to be honest. But yeah, I don't know. So let's see. For sure, we'll need a lot of quality assurance techniques and assurances before we can really let them pervade everywhere. I agree.
So I think somebody mentioned that the way AIware is being used is where the money is being made. And traditionally, software engineering and telephony and whatever, money was made in pornography and war. And so these are two areas that it's going to be used whether you like it or not, right? So I think it's a little bit probably so the question is though how and what sort of each context, what sort of ethical considerations are, and I think we heard quite a bit about ethical considerations in the previous talk and how to handle that. But unfortunately, I think if there's money to be made, it's going to be used. So I think that's something that's just sort of.
I wish we could keep talking, but we have to get out of the place by 5. So let's thank our panelists. It was a very engaging discussion. And I just want to conclude it by saying, I want to talk to Jack and May after this.